All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. Welcome if you're new. Thanks for taking time out of your day to check the video out. We have more PlayStation news, rumors, and leaks to go over and cover today. We are starting with the Bungie situation because things are not looking good over there at Bungie to the point where PlayStation and Sony need to get directly involved. So we're starting here with a report where the title reads, Bungie misled Sony about its financial position ahead of acquisition. A damning report claims that Bungie misled Sony about its financial position ahead of its acquisition by PlayStation. The studio's management has come under scrutiny following a second round of mass layoffs within a year that didn't even spare longtime senior executives now. Many former employees are laying the blame solely on CEO Pete Parsons. The aforementioned report comes from veteran journalist Stephen Totilo, who spoke to former Bungie employees to get to the bottom of things. At least one of them addressed what many analysts and even the gaming community have been left puzzled by: Sony spending $3.6 billion to acquire the studio. The employee reckons that Sony overpaid for Bungie after the studio misled the PlayStation maker by selling, quote, things they were just not able to deliver, end quote. While Destiny 2, The Final Shape, has been widely praised, Totilo has been told that the latest cuts were being planned long before the expansion released. What's even more interesting is that it seems Bungie was a bit desperate to strike a deal with Sony. One of Stephen Totilo's sources said that if Bungie hadn't been acquired, it may have gone bankrupt. Quote, the alternate history is insolvency, end quote. This is what they said. Bungie had thousands of employees at one point, which have now been reduced to 850 following the latest round of layoffs. The studio hasn't released anything outside of Destiny and its sequel over the last decade and has gone through high-profile splits with both Microsoft and Activision in the past. It has also emerged that senior Destiny executives Luke Smith and Mark Noseworthy have been let go. Suffice to say, the common denominator here is Bungie's management. So this is actually kind of insane because it seems to confirm something that some people over the last year or two have been speculating, and that is that Bungie completely oversold themselves and essentially lied to Sony to convince them to acquire them. And you really have to wonder what type of position Sony was in to allow this to happen, because we have a report where a developer internally at Bungie is claiming that if this acquisition didn't happen, it would have been over for Bungie. And when we look at what's happening now, where hundreds and hundreds of developers are being let go like every quarter, and things are just getting worse and worse, it seems kind of obvious that the leadership at the top of Bungie knew what was coming. They saw the freight train that was coming, and they decided, you know what, we got to sell. We got to get our money now, and you know what, the rest will just spiral down the drain. And when it's all said and done, we will cash out, and it will be Sony's problem. That's literally what is unfolding in front of us. But you really have to question how Sony could have let something like this happen. There were immediately people questioning why Sony paid so much for Bungie. It's worth noting that Sony paid, I think, an extra $1 or $1.2 billion just for employee retention to make sure that they didn't have Bungie employees leaving left and right. And that's a massive mistake. Obviously, just money down the drain for Sony there, because look at what's happening. The studio is crumbling, and Sony, not Sony, but Bungie, it now has to lay off employees, hundreds at a time. So, yeah, very interesting stuff here. It seems like the truth is beginning to come out, and that is that Bungie was not at all in a good position, and the leadership seemed to have been aware that it was not a good position and it was likely only going to get worse, and they were never going to be able to follow up on the things that they promised Sony. But seemingly Sony may have been blind at the time, right? It's worth noting that when Sony locked down the Bungie acquisition, they did so at the same time that Microsoft announced they were acquiring Activision Blizzard after acquiring Bethesda. I have no doubt in my mind at this point in time that maybe Sony was a little bit blinded by that fact, and they maybe made a unwise decision or a knee-jerk reaction here in response. But we are continuing to talk about Bungie because we have even more information. A big Bungie project was canceled, but apparently it wasn't Destiny 3. Being reported by Push Square, there's turmoil at developer Bungie following another brutal round of layoffs, which saw over 200 employees let go and a further 150 or so reallocated roles within parent company Sony. Speaking about the drama on his Game Mess Mornings podcast this week, Jeff Grubb said that a major new project named Payback had been shelved as a result. Some fans suspect this game may have been Destiny 3, although it's never been confirmed as such. Following up on the speculation, Bloomberg journalist Jason Schreier elaborated that Payback had actually been canceled prior to the latest round of redundancies, and it was never Destiny 3 to begin with. Quote, Destiny 3 was not canceled because it was never in development, per people familiar. Bungie did some very early work on a spin-off project called Payback, but they canceled that a while ago, end quote. It sounds like development on Destiny 2 will continue with future expansions likely to be smaller in scale, as hypothesized by Jeff Grubb. Meanwhile, work continues in earnest on Marathon, the reboot of the developer's FPS franchise. So, yeah, another really interesting report that came out of this situation. There was a lot of confusion. Yesterday, there were headlines making the rounds that Destiny 3 was reportedly canceled, but it turns out that apparently Bungie was never working on Destiny 3 the entire time. They were working on some kind of Destiny spinoff. And you have to question, again, what's going on here, because, of course, we know Marathon is coming, and we know that there were like other incubation projects that Bungie was working on. But did Sony agree to acquire this studio knowing that they were not going to be making a proper Destiny 3? Because out of all the things that you would acquire Bungie for, you would think that's the number one thing, right? Maybe Marathon could be a big hit. Maybe eventually they can make a new IP and it could be a big hit. But Destiny is the established IP. It's the long-running live service. Of course, you're going to continue that, right? Apparently not. But things just keep getting worse for Bungie. I have another report here from VGC, where it says on Wednesday, the Destiny developer announced it plans to lay off 220 staff, roughly 17% of the studio. In a letter published on Wednesday, the Destiny creator cited, quote, rising costs of development and industry shifts, end quote, for what it called some of the most difficult changes the studio has had to make. Following the news, several former Bungie employees took to social media to voice their anger at the decision. A large amount of the backlash was directed at Bungie CEO Pete Parsons. You're a liar, a thief, and so many things we can't discuss publicly. This is what community manager Liana Rupert alleged on X. Step down and without the giant Sony payout. This isn't on Sony. This is squarely on the failure of leadership, plain and simple. Griffin Bennett, a former Destiny community manager, added, quote, Pete is a joke, end quote. C-suite taking accountability for any of this or just still withholding bonuses, and it'll be settled in-house, Bennett wrote on another post on X. Poor leadership has crushed one of the greatest developers of all time. Retire, Pete. Sam Bartley, another former community manager and community coordinator, wrote, coward, you did this. You chose this. I'm already listed as do not work with, and I don't care anymore. You lied to my face, straight to it. You also invited me to come see your new cars 2 days before you laid me off. 2 effing days. Leave now. So for those who aren't aware of what he's referring to, the CEO of Bungie, Pete Parsons, is being called out because as all of this was going on, shortly after he, got his big paycheck with the acquisition, he bought apparently like a bunch of extremely expensive cars, spending millions and millions of dollars. And of course, it's his money to do what he pleases with. But, you see stuff like this, it's hard not to feel a certain way where it's like, you clearly get to walk away the winner here, while people are just being, let go left and right. And that's on you, as the CEO. So there's developers, former Bungie developers, obviously they're not happy. But what's interesting is they're not placing the blame on Sony. They're not placing the blame on the dev teams or the managers. They're squarely placing the blame on the higher ups at Bungie, specifically Pete Parsons. So it really seems like this man destroyed this studio. And ruined one of the most respected studios in the industry. But we are going to continue to talk about Bungie here, but this is a little bit different. Maybe something potentially exciting. It's hard to say. But we have a report here from PlayStation Lifestyle. It says, as part of Bungie's announcement on Wednesday that it would be laying off 220 roles, the company also confirmed that they were forming a new studio within PlayStation Studios to work on a sci-fi action game. In a post on Bungie's blog regarding the layoffs, Bungie CEO Pete Parsons detailed some of the changes Bungie would be undergoing as part of the move, alongside integrating 155 roles into Sony Interactive Entertainment. Parsons said that they would be working with PlayStation Studios to form a new studio that would work on a game that was originally one of Bungie's incubation projects. Second, we are working with PlayStation Studios leadership to spin out one of our incubation projects, an action game set in a brand new science fantasy universe, to form a new studio within PlayStation Studios to continue its promising development. So, yeah, this is something that is definitely a big deal. We are now seeing, again, integration directly into Sony. I want to point something out here. There was a report that came out last year that claimed that apparently if Bungie went below a certain threshold financially, Sony would be allowed to come in and essentially take over. Not in some aggressive way, but it would be deemed necessary so Sony could try to essentially save the sinking ship. What we are seeing happen now with this confirms that it has gotten that bad at Bungie, that now Sony's leadership is taking over. And considering what former employees and developers are saying about the CEO, this seems like it can only be a good thing. And so Sony basically took this project and said, we are developing this in-house now. It will be a Bungie project made by Bungie developers, but it's going to be under the actual PlayStation Studios banner. Very interesting. Will be interesting to see what comes of this game. One last thing I want to mention here before we move on is that apparently PlayStation CEO Hermen Hulst, who's the CEO of PlayStation Studios, is apparently now directly in charge of Bungie as a whole. So he is now managing Bungie on top of all the other PlayStation studios. It seems pretty clear that Sony is just, telling the higher ups at Bungie to step down or to stand down, and they're going to take over and try to fix this. It's PlayStation's biggest acquisition ever, and frankly, it's turning out to be a disaster. I'm going to kind of give my final thoughts for now until we get more info. It seems clear to me that Sony made a huge mistake purchasing Bungie. I'm not saying this means they can't turn it around. I'm not saying that eventually it couldn't work out well for Sony and Bungie in the end. Really, it's going to be up to Sony at this point. It's clear that the current leadership, the current CEO of Bungie, knew how bad the situation was and knew that if he didn't convince Sony to acquire them, they would probably no longer exist. Now Sony has acquired them. They've had them for multiple years. Things are starting to go downhill rapidly. It's up to Sony's leadership now and their management to figure it out, to turn Bungie profitable, to make them sustainable, and to hopefully make it so that this is going to be the last round of layoffs, because obviously you feel sorry for all these developers that spent months working on this last expansion where it got great reviews and people loved it, just to find out that, sorry, you still got to go anyway. Meanwhile, the CEO is cashing out, right? It's a crappy situation all around. So I'm hoping that Sony, now that they're taking over the ship, I'm hoping that their expertise, right, in management and studio management can really help sort this out and get Bungie into a better place. And, a couple years down the line from now, maybe we'll be able to look back and be like, you know what, Sony taking over is the best thing that ever happened to Bungie. That's my optimistic viewpoint, but we will have to see how this continues to unfold. But guys, that does it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. If you did, be sure to leave it a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new, hit the bell notification icon, and feel free to share this video out on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.